Welcome, everyone, as you're joining. Nice to see where people are joining from today. So good to know it's sunny in Surrey too, George. That's cool. Not just in my neck of the woods.
Yes,
Somerset, great.
Needed to be then and there moment. Gary and the other manager, both very senior. Yeah. I say very senior. Technically, Louisa's at his level, and he's my boss. So.
Someone's not got their view
hierarchy, but I'm down to small fry.
Okay.
No, I'm small fry.
Wait, can I go?
Whatever, just if you mind sticking
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Do you want to sit on an office or on the desk or
Yes.
Okay. Then
It's big fish in a small pond.
Yeah.
It's nice to see so many people coming out, coming and joining on a very sunny day and picking behavioural science over being in the sun for lunchtime.
Making me doubt my decision now.
No, it's going to be good. It's going to be good. You'll come away infused about behavioural science and how you can use it in your campaigns going forward. So it'll be worth it for missing out on a bit of sun.
I am thinking it'd be lovely, but I'm also thinking just going to ask him.
There's no one else waiting in the waiting room now, so if you want to proceed, Ruth.
Thank you so much, Judy. That's great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to the CIPR East Anglia's 2022 Annual Conference Part 2, with the crucial difference that this session is being co-hosted with the CIPR's Local Public Services Group. Absolutely delighted to be co-hosting with you guys today, and a warm welcome to anyone from that group on the call. From East Anglia's side, I'm really pleased to be hosting this alongside my colleagues Judith and Ange and Wilson, and I believe we've got Rosaling on the call too. So welcome everyone, committee and non-committee alike. So yes, today's session will be led by behaviour change expert and co-chair of the Local Public Services Group, Dominic Ridley-Moy. Dominic, very warm welcome to you. Dominic is absolutely passionate about helping public sector professionals help their audiences make better choices. He's seen how applying behaviour change theory, often at low cost, can make a big difference to communications and services, leading to better outcomes for people as well as saving money. Dominic worked in-house for more than 16 years before setting up the Behaviour Change Network to help organisations run better campaigns and apply behaviour change theory to their work. Today, he'll share with us a very practical guide to embedding behavioural science in your communications campaigns. But before I hand over to Dominic, just a few quick housekeeping points. So you may have noticed already, the session is being recorded today, and we'll share a link to that as well as the slides afterwards. And those of you who also attended the conference back in May, you'll get all the links to the materials from the 16th of May at the same time. We are on Zoom webinars, so please do make the most of the Q&A feature to post any questions you may have. And remember, you can upvote your favourite questions so we know which ones to prioritise. So we'll make sure there's time at the end to put your questions to Dominic. And please do feel free to jump in on the chat to comment and engage with each other as well. And last but certainly not least, this session is worth 5 CPD points. So do remember to log those while the event is fresh in your mind. enough from me. I'm now delighted to hand over to you, Dominic.
Okay, so hopefully my screen is now shared okay, and you can see that all okay. So yes, so thank you for that kind introduction. So just to introduce myself, my name is Dominic Ridley-Moy, and I run the Behaviour Change Network. I'm a comms person by background, as Ruth said, having worked in local authorities and housing associations, and now work with organisations to run behaviour change campaigns and offer training, as well as also being heavily involved in CIPR. So today I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the theory of behaviour change, and then talk through some practical examples. So what I want to do is give you an idea of how you can start thinking about how people behave, what you do in response to those behaviours, and how you want to get them to shift to behave in different ways. And we'll go through a number of different practical examples, so things like climate change, littering, recycling. I'll say a little bit about the vaccine, not too much, as I'm sure we're probably all a bit sick of hearing about COVID, a bit on AI, and then I'll finally cover off habits and just a little bit about making healthier life choices and all that kind of thing. So just to say a little bit about behaviour change, and I suppose a lot of where the theory comes from. So
Dominic, sorry to interrupt. Before you carry on, I don't think the screen share works. So do you want to just take a moment just to try again? I've stopped sharing mine, so just in case you weren't aware.
Okay, sorry, I thought it was sharing.
Yeah,
so,
that's fine.
I'm just having trouble going back into it. If you just bear with me a second, apologies. It's always the way on these live things, isn't it? Apologies,
Yeah.
I'll be with you in 1 second.
No worries.
No, it's not working.
If you like, Dominic, I believe I saved a copy. Yes, I have got a copy of your slides. So if they haven't changed since yesterday, I could.
They're slightly updated. It's no, mate, it is coming in. So
okay, cool.
Let me do it now. Just bear with me 1 second. I was going to say, while you're while I'm just sorting out my slides, it'd be good to get a sense of if people are using behaviour change models at the moment. Just if you're using something like Combi or East, it'd be a good just to get a sense in the chat, just a quick yes or no as to whether you're using any sort of behavioural framework like East or Combi in your work at the moment. Just a yes or no, just to get an idea. Right, so hopefully, is this working now?
Perfect, thank you, Dominic. Sorry to interrupt you.
Apologies.
No worries.
Okay, so right now that the technology is working. So yes, just to say a little bit about behaviour change theory. So a lot of the theory comes from the standpoint that a lot of the time people behave what appears to be irrationally, or actually do behave irrationally. So a lot of the theory and a lot of the models is bringing some scientific rigour to behaviour change. So thinking about how can you bring predictability to what looks like on the surface unpredictable human behaviour. So thinking about what influences human behaviour, how can we be confident that when we run campaigns and we want to change behaviour, that what we're doing actually will be successful, and really importantly, also thinking about how we can test those interventions. So I'm going to cover all of those different things. Apologies if I'm coughing at all, my asthma has been playing up a bit, so I'll try to keep that under control. So here's a quote from one of the architects of nudge. So if you've read any of the nudge books, here's something that Richard Thaler said back in 2008, which is that nudge is all about choices. how we make them and how we can make better ones. Every day we make decisions, and unfortunately we often choose poorly. So a lot of the theory is about helping people to make better decisions, whether it's around things like recycling, climate change, making healthier life choices, all those kinds of things. So that's where a lot of the theory is about. So just to say a bit more about unpredictability. So this is something that comes up a lot in all the work that I do around behaviour change. So here's a good example of that in practice. So this is my local TIP. What they did at my local TIP, for some reason, I'm not entirely sure why, they changed the parking lanes from what you can see in graphic A to graphic B. So they basically changed the lanes you could park in at the local TIP for whatever reason. They did that. And I suppose to a rational thinking person, it would be quite obvious where you park and where you don't park. But what has actually happened in practice is that people are now parking in all 4 lanes. People have no idea where to park. Part of it might be that the markings were still on some of the lanes. Other reasons that people may do it is that they just don't like the new system. But it's interesting how when you do things, often it can be quite unpredictable what happens, and the consequences are not the most rational or the most obvious in certain circumstances. So here's another really good example of that. So I do quite a lot of work with councils around fly tipping. And what often tends to happen is that if you put up a sign saying no fly tipping, that's where people actually fly tip the most. So telling people not to do something often makes things much, much more worse than the problem you're trying to solve. And then councils often make that problem even worse by coming away and clearing the fly tipping really quickly. So what happens is that people think, oh, well, actually, we can fly tip here, and the council will remove it and there'll be no consequences. So on screen, you can see some stickers that I've used. And I think one of the first variations had the message, "This rubbish will be removed." But we did lots of work to basically say, well, let's take that message off, because we don't want to create that perception that rubbish will be removed. So a lot of the time it's thinking about some of those kind of obvious messages and nuancing them slightly so that you don't reinforce the behaviour where actually you want people to do something and telling them don't do it just on its own doesn't work. So one of the things that's really interesting when you're thinking about planning behaviour change campaigns is that there's lots of different things that affect how people make a decision. And what I'd say is don't be afraid to test different things and different interventions. And also think about, well, how do people make decisions? So a lot of the time, our decisions are driven by emotions. So something like 80% of our decisions are driven by emotions and only 20% by practicality and objectivity. So something that we all know as comms people, that actually telling a story can be much more powerful and much more emotive than simple facts. And that there's lots of other things around us that make a big difference. And I'll come back to these points in more detail. So things like our socio-economic status, there's also lots of biases that affect how we behave, our beliefs, all those kinds of things, and they make a big, big difference. Also, we make something like, in a day, we'll make something like 35,000 decisions in a day. So we make a huge amount of decisions every day, so roughly 2,000 an hour. So things like, I'll decide whether or not to pick up this cup of water, I'll decide where to look for the next slide, whether to move the mouse, not move the house. So we're making lots of decisions throughout the day. So if you're trying to change people's behaviour in that sort of context, so if, for instance, you're getting people to recycle in the morning when they're making breakfast, getting the kids ready to go to school, all that kind of thing, the context there is very different to if you're planning a holiday or doing something like that. So we really need to think about that and how we what interventions we bring to bear so that they're effective. So one other thing that's important to bear in mind, particularly when we're making lots of decisions, is that as human beings, we strive to make rational choices, but we're subject to cognitive limitations. And one of the things we do on a daily basis is we use mental shortcuts known as heuristics. And they can be really helpful because we wouldn't be able to get through the day without them. So it helps us basically, all these kind of shortcuts go from one decision to the next. But the problem with these is that they can lead to what are called cognitive biases, and I'll come into that in a second. It's basically kind of unconscious errors where we kind of make these mistakes and they help us get by during the day. So a good example of a cognitive bias is that we're overly influenced by the first piece of information we receive. So take restaurants, for example. They use that to great effect, where they will encourage us to choose what is often the most profitable option on the menu. And then also if you look at, say, touchscreen menus in somewhere like McDonald's. And what's really interesting is that McDonald's, they did a randomized control trial where they basically, they ran two different kind of trials, where in some touchscreen menus, the healthy options were first, and on the other ones, the unhealthy options were first. And putting the healthy options first, that simple change led to a big uptake in the amount of people choosing those healthy options. So with a lot of the theory and a lot of the things, sometimes it's about having small tweaks. So whether you're looking at things like letters or text messages or touchscreen menus, or how people walk into a public advice service centre, subtle tweaks to all of the kind of layout, to your language, to colour, that all makes a big difference to the choices that people make. And that's particularly so in supermarkets, for instance. So supermarkets are masters of that kind of thing. So when you go into a supermarket, they think very much about what is the information you're receiving. So when you put your hand out, that's when all the stuff that they want you to buy will be on the shelf. It won't be at the bottom and it won't be at the top. When you come through the door, you're hit with either air conditioning or heating, depending on how the temperature outside. So it's a welcoming entrance that you get, and their layouts and how everything is done is very much, has all that kind of behavioural thought into it. So supermarkets have been doing this kind of stuff for years and years and years. And then there's lots of other different biases that we think about. So confirmation bias is another one. So thinking about someone like Donald Trump used that to great effect in his election campaigns, where it was serving up information on Facebook that confirms pre-existing beliefs, and then Facebook exacerbates that problem because it then serves up information that you already like and trust. So there's a number of different biases. So for us as comms people, it's thinking about how are we aware of those biases, and then what do we do in response. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about climate change now, and just thinking about how you can think about climate change through a behavioural lens, and some of the things you can do to start tackling some of the issues that are out there. So how do you start? Well, how do you approach climate change from a behavioural point of view? Well, with all these things, a lot of the time, often it's thinking about how do people behave? What are they doing it? What are they doing? How are they doing? When are they doing it? All that kind of thing. And then thinking, once you understand what people are doing, how do you use those behavioural frameworks to shift behaviours? So with climate change, this is a good exercise that I've used before with organisations, really thinking about the impact of different actions that people can do to have an impact on the environment, to have a carbon impact. But look at it not just in terms of the impact of the action, but how difficult is it to shift those behaviours. So that's a really good exercise to do. So something like renewable energy takes a lot of a lot of effort to install in your home, that something like plastics doesn't take as much effort to change your behaviour there, but the impact isn't as great. So what is helpful at that point is then to think about looking at your different behaviours and how you chunk them up into easier to move and harder to move. And I think the reason that this is important, because a lot of the time with these kind of campaigns, actually having a mix is really helpful. So if you're a local authority, for instance, having a broad brush campaign, you might want to focus on some of the easier to move awareness, raising objectives and shifting those, which are quick wins, won't have as much impact, while also doing some more targeted things, particularly around, say, installing renewable energy options and working with residents on that. And just as an aside, one thing that is quite interesting to know is that focus groups will tend to back up that an environmental message is rarely the best way to communicate climate change actions, and that's because so many other things come into play. And I think a good example of that is that, I mean, I've been having lots of conversations with people anecdotally about getting electric cars, and what's interesting, that the people I'm talking to, they're all quite climate change conscious, but the thing that's actually motivating them to make the switch is the impending 2030 deadline of moving over to electric cars. So it's that kind of, it becomes about ease, and it becomes about, there's a very definite deadline. So actually, what motivates people to do something, it kind of depends on the behaviour, and it's always about coming back to that. So with climate change, this is a useful slide just to think about how many different people are needed to take the action for the same amount of carbon reduction. So this is a good exercise to do, to think about, actually, if you are rolling out a climate change campaign, declaring an emergency, that kind of thing, thinking about what a difference your interventions will make and how many people are needed to make that difference is a useful way to think about evaluating it. So this slide here is, I'll just leave this up for a moment. This is quite useful to do as an exercise, whether or not, whatever the problem is, just to start thinking about, in quite simple terms, what are people doing? What are the barriers to behaviour change? And if you've come across the COM-B model, working through that and just thinking about what's happening and what do we want people to do. And this is the bit that people often skip. And because of that, your campaigns might not be as successful as they could be. So thinking about, you know, what is it we want people to do with, say, rubbish or recycling? How are they doing it already? Why aren't they doing it? Who are we trying to reach? And the reason that something like this is quite interesting, actually I'll come on to the next slide for this, is because some of the times it's not always obvious what the problem is. And actually the intervention, a lot of the time there is a tendency to think, we'll just tell people to recycle more, or we'll tell people to put their bins out there in the right way. And often that's not the problem that needs fixing. So here's an example of a street in South London where I did a day-long exercise knocking on doors asking residents. So I think the problem here was, it was flats above shops. And the enforcement team basically said that the problem was that people were putting their rubbish out throughout the week, and it's fly tipping, and we should find them all, basically. So that was the kind of problem we had. But what transpired quite quickly was that the people in these flats, they wanted to do the right thing with their rubbish, but there was simply no space for them to keep it in their flats. So actually working through what the behavioural problem was, what they were doing, why they were doing it, was more important, because finding them in this instance isn't the solution. So it's really thinking about what's happening, working through, and often if people want to do the right thing, just thinking about how do you help them rather than penalising them. So I'm just going to talk about the East framework now, and just how you can make that, use that in your work. So a lot of the time, these frameworks are really helpful because, as I was saying earlier, they can give you confidence that what you're going to do will have the effect that you want. And actually, the most obvious intervention might not be always the correct one and can sometimes be unhelpful rather than helpful. So a lot of the time making it easy is really, really helpful. So we're quite lazy as human beings, and our brains prefer tasks that require less thought. So actually just making something the default behaviour can make a big, big difference, which has worked so well with auto-enrolment and pensions, and just getting people to choose that as the thing that they do to get them to shift their behaviour. And then there's lots of other things we can do as well. As I said earlier, the McDonald's example of putting the healthy food options first, doing things like installing cup washers, so people bring their own cups in cafes and things like that can make a big difference. Also doing things like if you're encouraging people to eat less meat, putting the plant-based food choice as the default choice will make a big difference. So if you give people a default choice, they're much more likely to take it because it requires less effort. Coming back to climate change and kind of loft insulation. So loft insulation can make a big, big difference to the energy efficiency in your house, but often the barrier isn't that people don't want to do it. The barrier is that it's difficult to do. So actually thinking about how do you remove that barrier and combining with, say, a loft clearance service or something like that can make a big difference, because it's all about ease rather than the will. And also doing things like, I mean, there's lots of councils doing things like setting things to default eco settings on the appliances. So that's a kind of fairly obvious one that you can do. Again, with making it easy, it's also thinking about context. So with things like food waste and stuff like that, for example, putting messages near the fridge makes a difference, because when you're making a choice about what to do with food waste, you'll often be doing it near the fridge. So having the message kind of in and around the fridge and then building your campaign around that behavioural context makes such a big difference. So doing things like asking people to trust their senses and rearrange their food by, does it look out of date? Obviously wouldn't work for something like chicken or meat, but with fruit and veg, a lot of the time you could rearrange your fridge so you've got the food that you need to eat first on a certain shelf. And then there's other things you can build into that kind of campaign, like stickers and getting advocates involved, say younger people who might be keener to get involved and bringing them on board. So this is another part of the East model, so making it attractive. And this is really thinking about that a lot of the time, as I was saying earlier, we process a lot of information during a day. So we really have to think about how we get people's attention, how we get noticed, and a lot of the time making things stand out, emotive, bringing emotions to bear, also personalising things makes a big, big difference as well. So there's lots of trials with text messages, handwritten notes, handwritten post-it notes, all that kind of things, where the more you personalise things, the more that it makes a difference. And also using envelopes much more. So envelopes get very much unused at times, and often it's the thing that comes through the door and the first thing you see is the envelope. So the message you have on there will make a big difference as to whether people take notice. So particularly with something like debt, if you're in debt and you're ignoring all the letters that come through, that message on the envelope is really crucial. So if we think about something like recycling bins, making them much more attractive. So here's a company called Gumdrop. They do very bright pink bins to get your attention. So in a busy commuter street on the way to work, it really grabs your attention. And then also thinking about how you use language. So rather than calling something vegetarian, calling it something like spicy chickpea curry and reframing your language, and also kind of using social occasions as well, all your networks around you and how they can make a difference. Also, the Met Office, for instance, they're doing a lot of work at the moment to gamify their kind of messaging. So they've done a lot around Minecraft and engaging with audiences there. So that's a good way of kind of making things attractive. And then another thing you can do, particularly around climate change, is thinking about publicly displaying sustainability ratings, so food waste safe, that kind of thing. Thinking back to the science, another important technique is about discounting for the future, and that's something you can use for a whole host of different things, from I suppose climate change to kind of healthy living, to just getting people to shift their behaviour. So often, so if we take solar panels now, they will cost a lot to install. So there's a big barrier there. But actually we have this tendency to discount for the future. So if we have a smaller cash incentive now, so if we give people an amount of money, say £100, £200, even though the savings of solar panels can be a lot more, we're much more likely to take the smaller amounts now. So having that kind of upfront benefit now makes a big difference when we're looking to design our campaigns. So the next strand of the East model is all about making it social. So as we all know, we're heavily influenced by what others around us do. We very much look to what the group around us do, the power of networks, and also there's lots of things we can do to make those kind of interventions work much more. So if we make a public commitment, post it to our networks, have people to support us, use all those kind of things and layer it together, that makes a big, big difference as to whether we follow through with a commitment, whether it's starting exercising, stopping smoking, recycling, all those kinds of things. Those kind of commitment contracts, as they're called, can make a big, big difference. So, and a lot of it is it's getting the basic comms right. So showing else who else around you is doing, performing the desired behaviour. So if it's something like reducing dairy consumption, reducing meat consumption, show who else is doing it, but think very much around kind of who are the advocates, who are the kind of case studies you need, who are the people that will shift other people's behaviours, who do we believe, who do we trust? And thinking that through, because it's not always the people in positions of authority. And often thinking about those messages, so pride, fun and humour can often be the way to go rather than guilt. So a lot of the time there is a tendency to put that fine message out there for different activities, but actually that's not what will get people to change their behaviour. And then also thinking about particularly something like recycling or healthier life choices. How do you get people to turn things into a habit? And I'll come back to that in a bit more detail, but a lot of the time it's quite a gradual process and focusing on one thing. So this is a good example of how to make something social. So a lot of the time, if you've got a problem and you're thinking about how do you get people to coalesce and work around that problem, doing some sort of pledge. So here's a letter pledge that I've used, encouraging businesses to sign up to a letter pledge to say, we're going to clear up rubbish outside of our premises. And this kind of thing, and it can be used for a whole host of different things because it's very social, gets people involved. You get a critical mass of people working together, supporting each other. You get a peer group together, all that kind of thing. So it's a good way of getting people to pledge to do something, and then you can layer it into a campaign. So here's another good example. So here's something I've tried with fly tipping, which has been highly effective. So that message saying, don't fly tip here, just doesn't work, particularly in hotspot areas. So this is something I've rolled out in a number of areas, basically thinking about how do you raise that perception that you will be caught. So having that message, someone in your area has just been fined £400 for dumping rubbish, and then following that through into caught on camera videos, posters up on lampposts, all that kind of thing. Letters makes a big, big difference, because it increases that perception you will be caught, and actually people think it could happen to me. So it's not just it's not a vague statement that the council's put out. There are consequences to your actions, and that a lot of the time can be one of the things that is most effective. So here's the kind of before and after. So after the intervention, this is in South London, having all the kind of the new posters, the CCTV, the letters made a big difference. So that's something we've rolled out more widely. So I will just say a little bit about COVID here, but this is more in terms of programmatic advertising. So one of the things that's really useful to do is think about who is it that's conveying your message. So what we tend to call the messenger effect, and thinking very hard about who is it that you're using, whether you're using kind of, I suppose if it's online, whether it's video, whether it's graphics, and who is it that's actually communicating your message for you. And programmatic advertising is really useful at doing that, and testing a whole host of different adverts if you haven't used it. And I've used it for a lot of different campaigns because it's much more sophisticated. It kind of uses multiple data sources, and then you can do things like you can run surveys. So here's some results from back during the, I think, when the vaccine was first rolled out for COVID-19. And one of the things that we could do with programmatic was run different adverts targeted at people on lower incomes and from the BAME community, basically the kind of more hesitant population. And then depending on how hesitant they were at taking the vaccine, they then received different adverts off the back of it. So it was a good way of getting adverts out from a behavioural perspective. And what was really interesting during the pandemic, and something we knew already, this was in Wandsworth, that all the adverts that we ran that were council and NHS branded tended to perform, have much worse click-through rates compared with the adverts that had no organisational branding, which was something we expected, but it was good to get the evidence, because we knew from focus groups there was quite a lot of distrust of organisations. So that was really interesting to see. So making it timely. So this is something that's really important and something that often gets overlooked. So the timing of your kind of behaviour change interventions is really, really important. So thinking about when the behaviour is taking place, and when do you want to shift it? So if we take dog mess, for instance, keep it inside, you do a campaign with these kind of glow in the dark eyes, because a lot of dog mess offenders were being naughty at either dawn or dusk. So it was a good way of thinking about when's the behaviour taking place. And coming back to the example of the fridge, thinking about with food waste, that a lot of the time people will be getting rid of their food waste during when they're standing by their fridge, all that kind of thing. Also, when habits are disruptive, that's a really good time to change people's behaviour. So during COVID, so many people changed so many things about their life because their kind of fundamental circumstances and habits were disrupted. And also, I think when you move house, for example, it's a great example of when you can catch people and change their behaviours. So when I moved house, I had to change everything from my energy tariff to my phone provider, a whole host of other things, because I was forced to. So getting people and building your interventions around those trigger points is really important. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence, because it's a really exciting time for AI at the moment. So there's lots more data around at the moment. So the task really for AI is to help automate that. So one of the big trends we're going to see over the next few years, and we already seen at the moment, is that there's lots of opportunities to use artificial intelligence to make sense of that data and to use it for our kind of behaviour change campaigns. So here's something again I've trialled in Wandsworth, recently launched around encouraging people to report fly tipping and fly tip offenders by scanning a QR code and reporting it via sign on a lamppost with a company called Hello Lamppost. And this is a really good way of getting people to report fly tip offenders at the point when they're thinking about it. So it's a really good way of thinking, when are people actually thinking about the behaviour you want them to change, or if you want them to do something, and actually getting them to engage at that point. So here's a load of examples where Hello Lamppost have worked with different organisations, and it's that kind of thing about, I suppose, when people are thinking about a behaviour at a certain time, how can we get them to engage? So we've got an example here from a shopping centre in Manchester, encouraging people to get their smartphone out, engage with a conversation outside a shop and an AI chatbot, and turn it into a proper conversation. Here's another example from South Yorkshire Fire and Rescue, where they used it to ask residents whether they need a fire safety check as part of a wider conversation, and then the AI chatbot could find out whether they need it or not. And then at the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead, they've used it around kind of visitor experiences, so having questions on lampposts, benches, all that kind of thing. So it gets people to engage more, reduces staff time answering visitor queries, and people just spend more time interacting with their environment because it's in the right context. So that's a good example of how you can use AI to behaviourally inform what it is you want to do. So I'll just say a final bit about habits, and then we'll have some time for questions. So one of the things where I work with organisations a lot is around helping people to form habits. So helping people to exercise more, to eat more healthily, be more productive at work, all of those kinds of things. And there's a number of things that you can do. So there's roughly 6 steps to forming habits. And so I'll just talk through those 6 steps briefly, which you can use either in your personal life as part of your campaigns. So number 1 is about having a supportive environment. So with a lot of habits, making it as easy as possible makes a big, big difference, in having kind of consistent cues. So for instance, if you want someone to take their medication in the morning, saying to them, when you wake up and make a cup of coffee, make sure you take your tablet, and have that as the cue for them to take their medication, and have that consistent cue makes it much more likely you will continue that habit. And also things like writing down what the trigger is for any habit. So for instance, when you have a cigarette, thinking about what triggers smoking, and just having that awareness as a start makes a big difference. So number 2 is about making it easy. So as I was saying in the first point, kind of just how do you eliminate what we call friction? Make it as easy as possible. If you want someone to do something, make a habit as easy as physically possible. So if you're getting someone to exercise more and running a campaign there, thinking how can you make it as easy as possible to get them to start that behaviour. So don't start with something difficult, maybe start with something like just getting people out and about walking. Also embedding a habit. So according to UCL, the average time to embed a habit is 66 days. So kind of reinforcing that behaviour, encouraging people to do one thing over and over again. And with recycling, a lot of the tendency is to get people to recycle everything. But if you focus on one thing, they're much more likely to keep that habit up than if you focus on lots of things. As I said earlier, context is really important. So thinking about the context of your environment and what's happening around you. So COVID was a big one again, with huge amounts of people turning to cycling and exercising more and thinking about what was happening around them. And also thinking about how you reward people, so developing cues and rewards. So thinking like, if I floss my teeth every day, how will I reward myself? How do you fix that behaviour so it becomes almost automatic? So how do you get to those 66 days so that it becomes an automatic ingrained behaviour? So thinking about what you can do to reward people. And then finally, one of the most important things in keeping a habit going in the long term is building that meaning and motivation into your kind of, whether it's weight loss or exercising or whatever it is you want people to do. Actually, a lot of the time you can do steps 1 to 5, but if you don't have that reason for doing it, that kind of underlying motivation, often steps 1 to 5 won't be enough. So if it's losing weight, you need a goal along the lines of, it might be something around your health, it might be that you just want to look better. There's that kind of, having that motivation makes a big difference. So that was a kind of a whistle-stop tour of some of the ways that you can start thinking about behaviour change theory and applying it practically in your organisation. And I run a 5-week behaviour change course, which is online. Next date's starting off in September. So do scan the QR code or visit my website if you're interested in learning more about behaviour change, and always happy to have a Zoom chat. So we'll just go to any questions.
Oh, thanks so much, Dominic. Really practical, and yeah, lots to take away and think about. We have got a number of questions actually. I'm going to try and start from the top of the list. So David asks, he says, you say only 20% of decisions are based on practicality, but surely we must make a strong distinction between when people have a genuine choice and when they do not. So he gives an example, healthy eating campaigns that make suggestions that many people cannot afford. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it kind of, and it also depends on the context as well. So I think a lot of the time it's that kind of, so I'll come back to the example. I think if you're doing something where you're sitting down and spending a lot of time thinking about something, so it's the kind of thing, if you're filling in a long form or you're planning ahead, and I think a lot of the time you can use that kind of planning to your advantage. So I think if we take debt, for example, helping people to chunk up debt and putting it into simple steps, will kind of, you can help people go along that kind of rational thinking model. So kind of saying, right, okay, you've got debt, right, the first step is to make contact. So get people to make contact, get people to sort of think about how they're kind of saving, and chunk it up into one thing at a time, and that can make a big difference. I think a lot of the time it will be about context. And I think it's that, what is the context? So a charity, for instance, if you're getting someone to, if you want to encourage someone to sign up to give money to a charity, you've got a very short window for them to look at your envelope and open it. So actually that kind of pull on the kind of heartstring, that emotional message there is really important. So yeah, I think it all kind of comes down to context. I think that was the question, wasn't it? Did that cover? Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so This next one comes from Anne in our committee, and she's looking at it from an internal comms perspective. So yeah, she's really interested in how we can apply all this stuff in the internal comms environment. And she comments that the usual sort of in real life circumstances are obviously different in the workplace, especially when we consider the workforce now. We're either working from home or hybrid. And so her question is, can you share any thoughts and or follow-up reading specifically focusing on behaviour science for internal comms?
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of stuff you can do from an internal comms perspective. I think with all of these, the one thing that's kind of the slide on the when, where, how, why, that kind of thing. So breaking it down into what people are doing and then thinking, how can you shift that behaviour and what are the barriers? That's the most important thing to do, and then sort of working through that. So I suppose, for instance, I mean, it's less of a case study now, but I think, for instance, I've done things with getting people to use kind of IT help desks more and kind of report different issues, and actually having the message on the screen in front of you kind of at the time that they're kind of thinking about when to report stuff. That makes a difference. A lot of the time, I think it's thinking about kind of what that behavioural barrier is, and whether it's kind of getting people to go on training more, or to kind of, or if you're developing training and things like that. So there's lots of examples with training courses, and certainly local authorities have used things on forms where they've prompted people, there's been prompted choices. So something like, you know, if you answer this incorrectly, then you could be liable to a fine, and that's used, I think, by local authorities a lot. But equally, thinking when you're doing training courses, how you put those prompts in and stuff like that, using, I suppose, defaults a lot of the time. So opting everyone into an event, and saying you actively have to opt out of an event to not come along. There's a whole host of things like that, but it's always that kind of, what do you want people to do? What are they doing at the moment? And what are the barriers? And then working it through. So it's the same principles, but just applying it to an internal comms
just
problem.
I think work practical.
Work out what people are doing, and then work out what you want them to do, and then segment it as you would for any campaign, but think of it from behaviours rather than any other standpoint. Yeah,
that makes perfect sense. I love this because I think certainly as a novice to all of this, it seems terribly at the beginning sort of, it sounds, well, maybe it's the word science, it sounds very scary and a bit overwhelming, and actually what you're saying is like largely use your common sense, just think through how you would behave, react in that scenario.
I mean, I think
in the shoes of your target audience really, and try and think
it becomes interesting just when sometimes, as I was saying earlier, the obvious thing doesn't always result in what you want people to do. So there's this great example of I think like a nursery, I think in Israel, and they parents were picking up their kids late, so they started fining them for, like, if you pick your kids up late 10 minutes, you pay this amount. If you pick them up 20 minutes late, you pay this amount. And everyone's like, oh, okay, I'll just pay the fine. And it gave them permission to be late. So that's when it gets interesting.
Yeah. So another context, that this question comes from Tina. She asks about situations where your target perhaps aren't on smartphones, don't do digital. I'm guessing that's where you switch to more traditional forms of things like direct mail, and that's where your envelope example would come to the fore. But so I think that's really interesting. So I'm still doing lots of work around the vaccine, for instance, and so the work I'm doing at the moment is it's targeting the very hesitant communities, the ones who all the kind of broad brush comms hasn't convinced them to take the vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccine as yet. And at the end of the day, from all the evaluation I've done so far, in terms of broad brush channels, it's an old-fashioned letter that's most effective, coupled with very, very intensive engagement work with people that they trust.
And yeah, so a lot of the time that's about conversations and engagement, and not about digital. But digital is really useful if you want to kind of test something. And with programmatic, you can test hundreds of adverts and creatives at once to get a good sense of whether something will work or not.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes good sense. I think I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat, so I'll indulge myself with a question of my own, actually, as we've got a couple of minutes. Just drawing on your own experience, Dominic, you obviously got hundreds of examples, but perhaps you could share with us a campaign from, doesn't have to be super recent if you don't want to draw on yet another good example, but actually I was going to ask a campaign where you've been particularly surprised by how well it's worked and sort of your insights. Maybe there was a particular challenge or just something a little bit quirky.
I mean, this is an example I often use, and I think it's not, I'm not sure as necessary. Well, I was kind of surprised and not surprised, but it was one of those things where it's, I think sometimes thinking outside the box and thinking a bit differently can be the way forward. And it was local authority. I was working in-house at the time, and basically they were, this was many years ago, they were moving to online renewals for parking permits. Mm-hmm. So they wanted to encourage people to basically renew their parking permit online. And there was this big drive to shift everyone online, because it was at the time when cuts first came to local authorities around, I think, 2008 or so. And I remember sitting down with the service, and their take on it was, let's run an advertising campaign and do this, that and the other, and traditional sort of adverts in papers, and I think back when papers were a thing, and online and stuff like that. So we didn't do that, and I worked with them to do something a bit different, which was basically, we just, when people were, I think when their parking permit came up for renewal, we just wrote to them and said, you can now renew your parking permit online. We stayed silent about the fact that you could also ring up, or I think we either stayed silent or put it on the second page, that you could ring up and basically rebook via the phone or in person. And we ended up with something like I think like a 90% renewal rate online. So it was hugely effective, and I think it was that kind of thinking about just doing something differently. And I think it's that often with, there's a great example, not something I was involved in, but there was a council again with parking. I think they put their parking, they put their cash machines for parking at the back of the car park, and not at the front of the car park, and the usage for their app went up like that. So it was about, how do you make something a default choice? People are often in a car park, they'll come out, they'll be quite lazy, they just want to pay as quickly as they can. So if you make the app the easiest choice, people will shift their behaviours. So that was, yeah, and that worked really well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dominic. There's so much to think about. Everyone will be sharing the recording afterwards and the slides, so there'll be plenty of opportunities to kind of review and digest, and do bear in mind Dominic's upcoming course, and you've got a website as well, haven't you, Dominic?
Yeah.
No, great.
Right, well, and I'll send it round, so if anyone's interested. And I'm always, if you're interested in finding out more and booking onto my course, I'm always happy to have a chat just to see if it's right for you or not. So yeah, do feel free to, always happy to have a coffee and a Zoom chat.
Brilliant, that's fantastic, Dominic. Well, sadly, we're going to have to leave it there for today, just because we're running rapidly out of time, and I promised everyone a hard stop at 1:30. Just very, very quickly before everyone runs away, just a couple of things to share with you. So as I've said, we'll share all the materials afterwards. Also, big thank you to Ruth Dale, who I think is on the call today. Ruth runs social insight marketing, and she's got various bits and pieces of training and fantastic resources on her website as well. She's offering a 10% discount for attendees today, so do bear that in mind as well. And if you sign up for her newsletter, you get access to things like her cheat sheet on some of the models that you can use. Reminder to log those 5 CPD points, and please do share any feedback you might have with us on Twitter and LinkedIn. And lastly as well, do remember to sign up to our newsletter, and you need to do that via your membership login on the CIPR website. If you don't do that, we can't update you on fantastic events like this because of GDPR, so please do remember to do that. Quick plug for membership of CIPR. If you're not already a member, it's very affordable. You really do get access to a very wide range of benefits, not least of which is events like this, as well as networking, training, development, and the website itself has got lots of really useful resources. So do consider that. And as I say on the slide, it's very affordable, under £20 a month. So if you're not a member, please do think about that. And some of you will be aware we've got the Pride Awards open for applications at the moment. I'm afraid you've missed the early bird deadline, but there is a late deadline, the 22nd of June, so you've still got time to get your application in. If you would like a chance to showcase either your or your team's work from the last year, any particular campaigns that you think merit recognition, then please do enter those. We usually get some fantastic, very high quality entries, so it's a great platform to be showcased on. And that's it really. I think before we sign off though, obviously I want to say a very big thank you to Dominic and to the local public services group for co-hosting with us today. Thank you all very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day. I hope you managed to enjoy some of the sunshine later. Thank you very much. Wishing you all a very good afternoon.
Thank you for having me.